Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Welcome to Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell, a Catholic variety program broadcasting here on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio out of Jackson, Michigan. I am Phillip Campbell. I am going to be your host and traveling companion for the next half hour, and I'm very pleased that you are tuning in again to Faith Matters. Now, I've spoken before on this program about the idea of faith and how it's very often misunderstood. Some people treat faith akin to something like belief in Santa Claus or something like the Tooth Fairy, something that we all wink at and we go along with, even though we know it's all rubbish, it's all just a charade. Faith is treated as something that we have in lieu of evidence. It's like you have evidence and facts on one hand, and then on the other hand, you have just blind faith. It's like something we default to when all we have to show is ignorance. This is a very errant way to look at faith, and we often see this in the movies and in television, like these situations where it's like, well, Jimmy, I know things look grim, we're outnumbered, and our friends have betrayed us, and the zombies are coming, and we're out of ammunition, and also we have the plague, but we have to keep believing. We can't lose faith. You ever seen these movies where the theme is have faith, just believe, just keep believing? And I'm like, faith in what? In movies, faith is just some kind of vague, amorphous thing. It's like an irrational confidence that everything will work out just fine. Why? Just because. Because I believe hard enough that it will. In other words, faith is something that is presented as just existing for its own sake, that the act of believing is praiseworthy in and of itself, apart from what you believe in. Believe just because. You ever seen those decorative signs they sell in the arts and crafts store that just say believe on them? I know some of you have them in your house. It's okay. I have one too. But I look at that and I think, believe in what? It makes sense if you're Catholic, believe in the Catholic faith, but they just say believe. Now what I'm getting at is faith, if it's authentic faith, it must be faith in something, or rather in someone. Faith ultimately is an act of trust in a person. That's what it means to have faith. What are the things we have faith in life? We talk about having faith in, I have faith in my father, I have faith in my friends, I have faith in the company, or I have faith in the church. What do we mean when we say that? We ultimately mean that faith is an act of trust in a person. For example, if my dad tells me he's going to pick me up at the corner at noon, I believe him. I believe him because I have faith in his words. I trust him. I trust that he will be punctual. I trust that if I show up at the corner at noon, that he will be there to pick me up because he said so, and because my Father is good for his word. Incidentally, there's a great story about the German philosopher Immanuel Kant from the 18th century. He was so punctual about being on time, about being at certain places at a certain time. He'd walk by the same street every single day at the exact same time. And he was so punctual with his time that the shopkeepers on that street would set their clocks based on the time that Immanuel Kant walked by. They had tremendous faith in his punctuality. I've had similar circumstances in my life. One time, I was meeting a friend of mine at a park, and I told this friend, her, be at the park at 3 p.m., but you see, I neglected to tell her which park to go to. There were 2 parks in the town. And I went to one park, of course, and she went to the other park. And eventually she figured out that she was in the wrong place, and she came to meet me. She was a little late, and she said, you know what? I got to that park, and when it got to be 3 p.m. and you weren't there, I immediately knew I was in the wrong place because you're always on time. So she had faith in my punctuality. But whether we're talking about Immanuel Kant or myself or my father or any of the other various examples we can draw from real life, to have faith in a person is to trust them, to trust their word. Now, for a Catholic, our faith is ultimately in God. In the Creed, we profess, I believe in God, every Sunday. That's the first words of the Creed. Credo in unum Deum. I believe in God. We believe the truths of the Catholic faith, not because they suit the opinions of the times, because they certainly don't. Not because it's popular, not because it's easy, not because I'm Polish or I'm Sicilian and that's just how my family runs. My history professor in college once told me a story that he was in France conversing with one of his French acquaintances, and this Frenchman was expressing support for things that were very contrary to the Catholic faith. And my professor said to him, how can you support those things? You're Catholic. And he said, of course I am Catholic. I'm Catholic like I'm French, like I'm white. He's Catholic like he's French, just like he's white. It's just something you're born with. And we don't think about it. It's unchangeable. We don't want to be Catholic in that way. Not because our grandma will be disappointed if I don't show up at Mass and make some external show of going through the motions. No, the only reason we're Catholic, or I should say the only reason we ought to be, is because we believe those things professed in the Creed to be from God, to be revealed from God, and hence worthy of being trusted, worthy of being believed. Now, culture and family and other factors certainly might reinforce faith. I think we would all love a culture that was more washed in the Catholic faith. There's so many of these wonderful traditions and social conventions that come from the old world, from Catholic countries, that really buttress the Catholic faith and make it easier to practice your faith as a society. And I think we'd all love to see more of that, more things culturally that would make things a little more conducive to Catholicism. But all of that is ultimately just aids to our faith. Faith itself is an assent that we make to God when we say, I believe, O Lord. Well, Philip, you might say, I'm not so sure I do believe the teachings of the Church are revealed by God. Whatever your reasons are. Maybe you're scandalized by things you hear going on in the Church. Maybe you just don't understand what the Church teaches. Maybe you have trouble seeing the relevance of faith in the world today. But that's okay. If you have trouble believing, God bless you, my friend, because we can't just force ourselves to believe. Yes, in a certain sense, we choose to believe, of course, but remember, faith is also a gift. Faith is a grace. In our Catholic tradition, we call it one of the theological virtues, along with hope and charity. Yes, belief, faith is something we do, but it's also something God does. It's a real paradox, the relationship between the faith that we assent to, faith as a gift from God, between our freedom to believe and the grace that God gives us to enable us to believe. It's kind of like a dance between God and man. You know, in a dance, traditionally, it's a two-partner thing, but the man leads and the woman follows, and then together they make this lovely motion, this free-flowing motion. That's kind of how it is between God and man, a dance where God leads and man follows, but it's done together. This is why in the gospel, the man says to Jesus when he's asking for a healing, he says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That's the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verse 24. What a remarkable statement that is. The man confesses his faith, but also admits that he needs the Lord's assistance to make it fruitful. He both admits the strength of his belief and his unbelief in the same statement. Ultimately, man may water, but God gives the increase, and the man in the gospel recognizes this. He confesses his faith and then asks for the Lord to help his unbelief by strengthening his faith. So this is why we always pray for faith, and there's so many occasions in the Catholic life when we do this. If you pray the Rosary regularly, as I encourage you to do, there's a custom that we offer the first 3 Hail Marys of the Rosary. You know, the 3 before you start the mysteries proper, right after you do the Creed and the Our Father. Each of these 3 Hail Marys can be offered for an increase in faith, hope, and charity. We also have a traditional prayer called the Act of Faith, which many of you might know. It goes, "O my God, I firmly believe that you are one God in 3 divine persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. I believe your divine Son became man, died for our sins, that he will come to judge the living and the dead. I believe these and all the truths which the Holy Catholic Church teaches, because you have revealed them, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. And that's a prayer where we confess our faith, but we also are asking God to bless and increase that faith. In other words, we believe the best we can, and then we ask God to increase what we have. We have the talents that are given to us, and then we ask God to bless and multiply those talents. So we need to pray, because ultimately the faith we have in God is not merely natural. I gave an example earlier about having faith in my dad picking me up on the corner. I can have faith in my dad's word, but ultimately my dad is just a fallible human being. I believe him because he's been good on his word before, but my dad's not infallible. My dad is not incapable of breaking his word. But that is the case with God. And so faith in God requires a very special kind of faith, a supernatural faith, because how we believe is proportional to the trustworthiness of the person we have faith in. You know, there's some people in my life, and I think there's people in your life too, if they were to say to me, Philip, I'll be there for you. I'd lay down my life for you. If you're ever in a pinch, I am there for you, buddy. And I would believe them absolutely 100%. Now, there's other people where if someone said, you know, the whole world is going to end unless you can simply be at a certain place at a certain time. And I'd say, oh, we better kiss everything goodbye because they're not going to show up on time. So we know that faith in humans is always variable. But God is truth itself. He cannot lie. He cannot break his word. Unlike my dad or my buddy or anyone you know, God is incapable of breaking his word. That's why we say the sort of faith we have in God is supernatural. It goes beyond mere human faith. And that aspect of faith, the ability to fully commit ourselves to God and say, Lord, I believe, there's a supernatural element to it. It is a gift. It's a grace of God. Now, if you don't believe that faith is a gift, if you don't believe it's a grace, let me ask you this. Have you ever successfully argued a non-believer into believing? Did that long internet argument ever end with the person saying, well, Karen, I'm 100% convinced I'm converting? I wish I would have had a cricket sound ready to go right now, because that's what we would hear. I mean, really, have you ever argued someone into converting? I think most of us have found in our lives that a person can't be argued into belief. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there's no place for rational discourse or argument. Otherwise, why would we have all these forms of media explaining the faith, obviously? St. Peter says, always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within you, in 1 Peter 3:15. There's a long tradition of apologetics in the church, so certainly rational argumentation has its place. But the fact is, something has to give way in a person's heart before they are ready to listen to an argument for faith. One of the greatest conversion stories in Catholicism is that of St. Augustine of Hippo. St. Augustine was born in the late 4th century in a world where the Roman Empire was already moving towards Christianity, but it was still coexisting with paganism and all sorts of Greek philosophies. His father was a pagan, his mother was a Catholic. St. Monica was his mother. She prayed for his conversion to faith, but St. Augustine dallied around in the pleasures of the world, and then he got involved in all sorts of neo-pagan Greek philosophies, and then he went into the Manichaean heresy, and he went through all these different things. And he thought Catholicism was silly. Now, St. Augustine was raised in a culture where Catholicism was prevalent. He knew what Catholicism was. He knew Catholics. His mother was a Catholic. His mother was a saint. So clearly his problem was not that he wasn't acquainted with what Catholicism was, but there was a hardness of heart that needed to be softened before he could change. Now, eventually, Augustine came into what we would call an existential crisis. He began to ponder these big questions. Why am I here? Who is God? What is true? What happens when I die? What is the nature of the soul? And he found that the various philosophies that he'd gone through were incapable of answering these very fundamental questions. And that brought him back to Catholicism eventually. And through reading the life of St. Anthony, through talking to Catholic friends, through the preaching and the help of St. Ambrose, through the prayers of his mother, he started considering Catholicism. Catholicism had always been there. Its arguments had always been there, but his heart had to be softened. And once his heart was softened, then he was ready to listen. And he was out in a garden one day in his friend's estate, just having a crisis, an existential crisis, weeping, wondering what he should do. And he finally hears children in the next garden playing a game and chanting "Tolle legge," which means take up and read. I wonder what kind of kids game that is where they're saying read. I don't think kids play games like that anymore. But at any rate, he picks up the Bible, reads the book of Romans, and every obstacle just melts away in his heart. He says yes to the Lord, and his life is changed. So the story of St. Augustine shows us that rational argumentation certainly has its place, but there's something in the heart that has to move. God has to move the heart by grace. You have to be disposed to allow that rational argumentation to work in your life, and then it does. St. Augustine summed up this process in this lovely quote, "I believe that I may understand." Or the medievals had a formula, fides quaeruns intellectum, which means faith seeking knowledge. Faith and knowledge go together in a very particular way. Now, if you know people in your life who are very strong in faith, maybe you have the proverbial Catholic grandma who's always counting her rosary beads and praying nonstop. People who are strong in faith, it's not necessarily because they have more knowledge or they know more about Catholicism. Your 85-year-old grandma counting her rosary beads might not have access to all the information you do about Catholicism. Rather, their faith is strong because they understand it requires grace to grow, and they regularly pray for that grace. They nourish it, and they entrust their wills to God, asking Him to give the increase. Now, if you're doing this already, then study does avail much. I was personally born Catholic. I mean, I never made a First Communion. I never went to Mass. I think it was more of a cultural thing. I came from a Sicilian Polish family. So I was never raised with the faith. And had you tried to argue with me about Catholicism when I was 16 or 17, I don't know what kind of effect it would have had. It probably wouldn't have had much. But eventually I got to a place in my early 20s where I started seeking deeply. And when I discovered the church, I read everything I could about it. Things I would have never read before I started reading because my heart was disposed. Grace had prepared me. The soil in the garden of my heart was ready and fertile. And when the soil of the heart is prepped by grace, study is like rain from heaven, and God will bring forth the fruit. Now, faith doesn't depend on study. Otherwise, salvation would be the exclusive possession of the educated. But of course, knowledge can build and strengthen faith. And the church traditionally called these faith-building facts motives of credibility, that is, buttresses to our faith. Motives of credibility can include various things like the logical coherence of the truths of the faith, or the historical continuity of the church through the ages, despite overwhelming odds against it. The Anglo-French writer Hilaire Belloc has this great quote on this. He says, quote, "The Catholic Church is an institution I am bound to hold divine. But for unbelievers, a proof of its divinity might be found in the fact that no merely human institution conducted with such knavish imbecility would have lasted a fortnight." That's a great argument for the divine protection of the church. No institution, no merely human institution conducted with such knavish imbecility could have lasted a fortnight. And yet here it is, 2 millennia later, going strong, the oldest continuously existing institution in human history. We could look at the witness offered by the holy lives of the Church's saints, or the prevalence of well-attested miracles throughout Catholic history. There's a great secular historian named Ramsay MacMullen who writes on the late Roman Empire, and I was pretty surprised when I read his works on the Roman Empire that the number one reason why people in the Roman Empire converted to Christianity was because they themselves either witnessed a miracle or they heard about a miracle from somewhere, and that led them to convert. If you want miracles, hang around Catholics. Now, all of these things that we can study and learn about, they reinforce our faith in God or they help build it up. This is why there's real value in study to help build faith. Faith is a work, essentially, but it's also a grace. Work and prayer. Ora et labora, as the Benedictines say. Work and prayer. Now, I guess this all leads me to ask you something personal. And I'm speaking to you folks who might say, I'm wavering in my faith. I don't know if I believe. I don't know if I have faith in God. So I want to ask you this, and I'm not putting you on the spot because I need to reflect on it as well. But you who say that you're not sure if you believe, how much effort do you put into building your faith? You say, my faith is weak. Well, let me ask you this. Do you keep company with faithful people, or do you mainly hang around people whose habits are scandalous? Do you read spiritual books at all, or books about the Catholic faith? If someone walked into your house, would anything about the reading material in your home or the decor you keep suggest that you are Catholic? Are there any tangible reminders of your faith around you? Do you pray regularly? Do you go to Eucharistic adoration? Do you pray the Rosary? Do you have a devotion to the Blessed Mother? Do you go to confession regularly? Are spiritual things important to you? The Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about a condition called acedia, A-C-E-D-I-A, if you want to look it up. And it's basically an apathy about spiritual things, like you just don't really care. And if you're in that state, that's a very dangerous spot to be as a Catholic. And you got to rouse yourself and break out of that spiritual sloth. Do you go to Mass regularly and attentively? Now you might say, well, I'd go to Mass more if my faith were stronger. If I had stronger faith, I would do more of these things. Look, that's silly. That's backwards thinking. That's like saying, man, I'd go to the gym more if I had bigger muscles. Or I'd take a shower if I wasn't already so dirty. Look, you go to the gym in order to get the muscles you want. You go to the shower because you are dirty. You go to Mass or pray or do these things precisely because you need to get stronger in faith. Now again, I'm not putting anyone on the spot here. This is a reflection that every single Christian needs to make, starting with this guy right here behind the microphone. But before we blame God or the church for our own shortcomings, let's consider how we've managed our own garden of faith. If the land isn't tilled, if the seeds aren't planted, if the fertilizer isn't applied, how are you going to expect to grow anything when the rains come? So these are all very important things for us to consider, my friends, as we go throughout our week. But I do think that's enough to think about for today. So, again, thank you for joining me. And until next time, this has been Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless.